The bells at Westminster Abbey tolled 101 times on the morning of 9th April, 2002. One stroke for each year of Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother's life. By then, more than 200,000 people had already filed past her coffin during 3 days of lying in state at Westminster Hall. Another million lined the procession route through London. Parliament had been recalled from Easter recess 6 days earlier, specifically to pay tribute. The funeral cost £5.4 million. 10 million people in the United Kingdom watched it on television. She was, by any measure, one of the most publicly mourned figures in 20th-century British history. The Guardian's obituary described her as someone who remained almost untouched by the royal troubles of recent decades. The Daily Telegraph called her a resolute queen during the Second World War. The adjectives were consistent across every major outlet: steadfast, beloved, irreplaceable. Academic research from the late 1990s had consistently placed her at or near the top of royal popularity measurements, even during years when the institution as a whole was struggling. She was the friendly face, the grandmother of the nation, the woman in the pastel hat who waved at everyone as if she meant it personally. The image was real, and the image cost an enormous amount of money to maintain. On the same day her death was announced, March 31, 2002, the morning after, The Guardian ran a second piece alongside the tributes. The headline was, "The End of an Aristocratic Era of Style, Opulence, and Overdrafts." It named her bank. It named a figure that had been circulating in press circles for nearly 3 years. It noted, without particular drama, that somewhere in the quiet machinery of royal finance there was an accounting that needed to be done. 4 days after her death, the same paper ran a piece headlined, "The Gamble That Foiled the Taxman." The mourning was genuine. The reckoning was coming regardless. By February 1952, when George VI died and left his 51-year-old widow to begin the next 50 years of her public life, she had already spent 16 years performing the role of queen consort. She understood what the performance required. What the Queen Mother offered Britain wasn't simply affection. It was spectacle. Warmth made visible on a grand scale. Generosity extended so consistently and so gracefully that it came to feel effortless. It wasn't effortless. It was staffed. She had spent the years of her marriage defining a particular aesthetic of royal abundance, warm, approachable, thoroughly British, but unmistakably magnificent. The 1938 state visit to France, for which designer Norman Hartnell created an all-white wardrobe during a period of royal mourning, was later identified as the moment her public image locked into its definitive form. Hartnell dressed her to be luminous. The aesthetic stuck. By the time she became a widow, it was inseparable from the person. And continuing it wasn't vanity. It was institutional obligation. Her civil list allocation, the annual public stipend, stood at £70,000 in the early 1970s, when a cabinet debate rejected a proposal to double it on grounds of public sensitivity. The final figure agreed then was £95,000. By 1990, Parliament formally raised it to £643,000 per year through statutory order, a figure substantially larger than the £186,500 allocated simultaneously to Prince Philip. That allocation made the Queen Mother the most expensively subsidized non-sovereign member of the royal family. £643,000 sounds substantial. The annual wage bill for staff at Clarence House alone was £1.5 million. That gap, nearly £900,000 in just one address's payroll, is the structural fact at the center of everything that follows. The civil list wasn't set to cover her costs. It was set to meet a political expectation of what seemed reasonable to explain to the public. The actual running costs of being the Queen Mother were a different number entirely, and that number was never officially stated. What was known, from contemporaneous accounts, she maintained 5 residences simultaneously. She employed between 60 and 100 staff, depending on which account you consult. Contemporaneous accounts place the number at more than 50 in London alone, including 5 chefs, 3 chauffeurs, and 5 or 6 cars with special registration plates. A niece who served as a lady-in-waiting described the hospitality in concrete terms. For 3 weeks each August, at the Castle of May in Scotland, the Queen Mother held house parties with up to 8 guests, a completely new group arriving every week. Nicholas Soames, a close friend of Prince Charles, described arriving at Birk Hall after a full day's stalking on the hill. By midnight, with most of the party half asleep at the dinner table, the Queen Mother was still, he recalled, the life and soul of the gathering. On her 98th birthday, after a succession of walkabouts, public engagements, and a trip to see Oklahoma in the West End, she finally sat down to dinner with a party of 8 at 11:45 in the evening and didn't go to bed until 1:30 in the morning. She wasn't entertaining because she enjoyed it, though she clearly did. She was entertaining because that was what she was for. The Treasury had been tracking this problem since at least 1962. That year, a formal memo was raised objecting to an invoice submitted by the Queen Mother's private office for haute couture expenditure. The specific figure noted was £1,500, which the memo calculated represented 2 or 3 Hartnell evening dresses. The Treasury's concern wasn't the taste. It was that public funds were underwriting the wardrobe of a woman who had already been the most photographed member of the royal family for 2 decades. By her final year, the gap between her official income and her operational costs had widened to a figure the press found quietly extraordinary. Reports from 2002 placed her spending in the last 12 months of her life at approximately £4 million more than her official income. She was maintaining 4 active residences. She had, by most accounts, more than 40 staff at Clarence House, and the civil list had not been sufficient to cover even her staff wages for years. The Queen, it was reported, contributed approximately £1 to £2 million per year to keep her mother operating at scale. The Prince of Wales reportedly paid £80,000 annually to supplement the wages of some of the older Clarence House retainers, whose salaries had not been updated with inflation. Her racing costs, she was a passionate supporter of national hunt racing, ran to approximately £1 million per year, borne at least in part by her daughter. None of this was publicly stated. It was simply how the arrangement worked. The Queen's late racing manager, Lord Carnarvon, was quoted in a contemporaneous account as observing that if there had been 2 of them spending at that rate, they'd have been broke long ago, and that she bought new outfits the way other people bought eggs. The question that tends to emerge here is whether any of this was genuinely a problem. She had assets. She had income. She had the support of her daughter. Surely a woman with a Monet on the wall could manage an overdraft. Understanding why the answer is complicated requires understanding what she was actually doing with all of this expenditure. She wasn't simply living well. She was producing something. Her public value, the warmth, the accessibility, the sense that she genuinely liked people and occasions, was entirely dependent on the infrastructure around her. The Clarence House drawing rooms, where she held her famous dinner parties, required staff to run them. The week-long house parties in Scotland required chefs, ground staff, game staff, transport, and a household that managed those arrangements day and night on her behalf. The racing appearances required appropriate dress, appropriate vehicles, and the institutional machinery to make them happen. Remove the infrastructure, and you remove the product. She had, as one researcher put it, essentially created her own public image, the first royal to do so consciously as a media-era project. The pastel coats, the Hartnell evening gowns, The warmth extended to total strangers at 100 public events a year. All of it required a material base to be credible. That material base was funded, in large part, by the state and by her daughter. The audience never saw the bill. The bill existed regardless. The properties illustrate this most plainly. She had the use of 5 residences: Clarence House in London, Royal Lodge at Windsor Great Park, Birk Hall in Scotland near Balmoral, Walmer Castle in Kent, and the Castle of May on the far northern coast of Scotland. Of those 5, exactly 1 was personally owned. Clarence House, Royal Lodge, and Birk Hall were all Crown properties. Their structural upkeep fell to the Crown estate. The operational costs, the staffing, the heating, the interior maintenance, the endless provision of hospitality, came from elsewhere. Clarence House was her primary stage set. According to contemporaneous accounts, it ran to a staff of more than 50 at its London base, 5 or 6 cars with a rotation of special registration plates, 3 chauffeurs, 5 chefs, and 3 liveried footmen who appeared with a full tea tray whenever a visitor arrived. A palace insider who knew the house described it to one journalist as another world, a time warp. It was exactly what it needed to be. Royal Lodge served as her Windsor base, with house parties in spring and autumn for her racing set. Birk Hall hosted her fishing house parties in May. Each address required its own staffing infrastructure, its own maintenance regime, its own operational budget. The Castle of May was the outlier, her own peculiar project. She had found it in 1952, the year George VI died, while still raw with grief. The castle, then called Barragill Castle, was semi-derelict, a near ruin on the Caithness coast, about as far north as mainland Britain goes. She bought it, reportedly for under £100, using money from her husband's estate. Princess Margaret later called it Mummy's drafty castle. The description was affectionate and accurate in equal measure. She spent roughly the next 8 years restoring it with her own funds, installing electricity, fresh water supplies, updating the fabric of the building. From 1955, she visited every August and returned for around 10 days in October, hosting 2 separate house parties in August and continuing to entertain through the Scottish autumn. Her final visit was October 2001, 5 months before her death. In 1996, 6 years before she died, she transferred the castle into a charitable trust, the Queen Elizabeth Castle of May Trust, registered with the Scottish charity regulator. The estate cost at least £500,000 a year to maintain. Rather than carry that cost herself, she placed the asset and an endowment into the trust, and subsequently paid rent only for her annual stays. The arrangement was practical. It also meant that when she died, the castle's future was already structured without requiring any sudden decision about its fate. This is worth holding. The woman who reportedly couldn't cover her own wage bill from her state allocation had, 8 years before her death, quietly placed £19 million into trust for her great-grandchildren, and 6 years before, legally structured her only personal property into a charitable vehicle with an endowment. She wasn't financially naive. She was financially strategic, selectively, in the areas that mattered. The art collection tells the same story. A Monet landscape, study of rocks, cruise, Fresseline, had been purchased in 1945 for £2,000. By 2002, it was valued at auction at up to £15 million. Her broader collection of paintings, including works by Augustus John, Graham Sutherland, L.S. Lowry, Millais, and others, brought the total art collection to approximately £35 million. Her jewelry, including a diamond necklace that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, carried a further estimated £16 million. Porcelain, silver, Fabergé eggs, clocks, furniture, another £15 million. These weren't decorations. They were assets that appreciated dramatically over the decades she held them, filling the interiors of houses that performed the Queen Mother brand, while growing in value in ways her civil list allocation never did. The paradox the press would eventually notice is that the woman running a reported overdraft at Coutts was simultaneously holding tens of millions of pounds in portable wealth. The resolution to that paradox is that liquidity and assets aren't the same thing, and the operating costs of being the Queen Mother bore no relationship to the notional value of the Monet in the drawing room. In July 1999, as the Queen Mother approached her 99th birthday, a journalist named Alan Hamilton wrote a piece in the Times. In it, he referenced what he called the small matter of the £4 million overdraft at Coutts, which, he noted, hasn't been denied, and which, it has been hinted, may even be an understatement. That sentence deserves careful attention. Hamilton wasn't breaking a secret. He was writing about something already circulating in press circles, naming a figure that no one in authority had confirmed, but that no one in authority had denied. The overdraft had been in the public domain for some time. What Hamilton was doing was saying it plainly, in a major national newspaper, nearly 3 years before her death. Coutts & Company was, and remains, the royal family's private bank. The Queen Mother's association with the institution was long-standing, and the bank's royal warrant was central to its commercial identity. Pressing the Queen Mother on her finances would have constituted an institutional crisis for a bank whose most significant credential was its connection to the Crown. The arrangement continued. The overdraft reportedly grew. When she died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, with Queen Elizabeth II at her bedside at 3:15 in the afternoon, the financial question that had been circulating for 3 years moved from the press's quieter registers to its front pages almost immediately. On the day her death was announced, The Guardian ran a piece titled, "The End of an Aristocratic Era of Style, Opulence, and Overdrafts." The piece named the £4 million figure. It also cited what was described as a joke the Queen had reportedly made, that Coutts would have folded long ago but for her mother's overdraft. The joke, if accurately reported, is dry enough to have been genuine. 4 days after her death, the same newspaper ran "The Gamble That Foiled the Taxman," focusing not on the overdraft, but on the other significant financial maneuver of the Queen Mother's later years. In 1994, at 94, she had placed approximately £19 million, roughly 2/3 of her liquid fortune at the time, into a trust fund for her great-grandchildren, including Princes William and Harry. The mechanism was straightforward. A gift made more than 7 years before death is exempt from the 40% inheritance tax. She needed to survive until 2001 for the exemption to apply. She died in 2002. The trust was fully exempt. This wasn't spontaneous generosity, though the money would go to family. It was a deliberate tax planning decision, advised by professionals, executed with precision. The woman who reportedly couldn't balance the Clarence House payroll had structured a tax-exempt transfer of £19 million with a 7-year horizon and survived the window comfortably. The Guardian's financial piece noted that by locking up a significant portion of her liquid assets in 1994, the trust had probably contributed to the Coutts overdraft. Cash that might have covered operational costs had been moved into a vehicle she couldn't touch. As for the overdraft figure itself, the most consistently documented number is the £4 million Alan Hamilton cited in July 1999. Some accounts suggest the balance had reached higher at an earlier point, possibly as much as £7 million, before being partially reduced. Time magazine's 2010 retrospective used the £4 million number, carefully noting it was reported at the time of her death rather than officially confirmed. No statement from Coutts, from the palace press office, or from the executors ever confirmed or denied any specific figure. The will was sealed. The executors proved it in the usual legal manner, but didn't make it publicly accessible, a standard arrangement for royal wills, achieved through court applications. How the estate's liabilities were settled was therefore not disclosed. What was disclosed in May 2002 under some political pressure. A palace summary placed the estate's value at between £50 million and £70 million in press estimates, not an official probate figure, which was never made public. The summary's most significant finding attracted rather less coverage than the overdraft had. Queen Elizabeth II wouldn't pay inheritance tax on her mother's estate. The reason was a deal reached with John Major's government in the early 1990s, an arrangement that the monarch pays no inheritance tax when inheriting from the previous monarch. The estate transferred entirely, tax-free. The mechanics from there are clear, even without formal confirmation. An estate worth between £50 million and £70 million, including a Monet, multiple Old Masters, a diamond necklace from Versailles, 23 years of accumulated Fabergé, and rooms full of fine porcelain, passes to the Queen. The estate includes liabilities. Standard estate administration requires debts to be settled before distribution. The Coutts overdraft, whatever its precise figure in March 2002, would have been addressed as part of that process. Multiple secondary sources state that Elizabeth II settled it quietly from her own resources. None carries primary source confirmation. What can be said plainly, an estate with tens of millions in liquid assets had more than enough to clear an overdraft that press reports put at £4 million. The arithmetic was never in doubt. What the overdraft represented, and what it has continued to represent in discussions of the Queen Mother's legacy, is the structural gap between the cost of performing the role and the resources officially allocated to perform it. That gap was real. It had existed for decades. It was absorbed, year by year, by her daughter, and by a state that had never quite caught up with what being the Queen Mother actually cost. She had told a dinner guest, according to one account, that she could do with £100,000, and that her bank manager had been scolding her about the overdraft that very afternoon. She said it lightly, as she said most things. It may have been the most revealing thing she ever said about her finances. On the 3rd of April 2002, 4 days after the death, the House of Commons was recalled from Easter recess. Parliament suspended ordinary business to pay tribute to a woman who had served the crown for longer than most members had been alive. The grief in the chamber was largely genuine. The institution, however, had already begun its practical reckoning. The most immediate question was the household. The Guardian ran a piece on April 2nd under the headline, "Thank you and goodbye," asking about pension entitlements and the futures of the Clarence House staff. The answers were imprecise. Entitlements would depend on job and contract. Some would find places elsewhere in the royal household, others wouldn't. For comparison, when Princess Margaret died 7 weeks earlier, in February 2002, just 2 of her 15 staff were offered alternative positions in the royal household. The Queen Mother's household was several times larger. Her will had asked the Queen to make certain bequests to members of her staff on her behalf. Those bequests, unlike the main estate transfer to the monarch, were subject to inheritance tax at 40%. It was a thoughtful instruction. She had thought about the people who had worked for her for decades. The tax liability on those bequests was also a reminder that the legal structures protecting the broader estate had no equivalent provision for the individuals inside it. The will remained sealed. A court application ensured it wasn't made publicly accessible, following the same process applied to other royal wills. The precise contents, who received what, and under what conditions, remained formally inaccessible. Clarence House was vacated, then renovated for several £1 million before Prince Charles moved in with his sons William and Harry on August 4th, 2003, 16 months after his grandmother's death. He had also inherited Burke Hall simultaneously. Charles and Camilla chose not to strip the house of its Queen Mother-era character. According to the Royal Collection Trust, they preserved the arrangement of the rooms and the groupings of their contents as a deliberate tribute. They planted a garden in her memory between 2004 and 2005, visible from Charles's office window, lavender by most accounts. The tribute was genuine. So was the inheritance tax exemption. Both were simultaneously true. Royal Lodge, the Windsor Grace and Favor property where she died, passed to Prince Andrew in 2003 under a separate commercial lease arrangement. He agreed to pay more than £8 million up front, covering £5 million in repairs, a further £2.5 million in lieu of rent, and a £1 million premium, in exchange for a 75-year lease with a nominal annual payment thereafter. The property the Queen Mother had used for decades as a weekend entertainment base had, by 2003, become a long-term commercial transaction for one of her grandchildren. Elizabeth II had spent decades quietly underwriting her mother's operations. The racing subsidy, the staffing contributions, the structural funding of a household whose civil list allocation had never been realistic. All of it sustained over 50 years without public acknowledgement. She was present at Royal Lodge on the afternoon her mother died. She had visited Windsor almost every Sunday, reportedly always arriving by a back route rather than the formal entrance, to avoid the appearance of overshadowing the woman she was visiting. What she inherited in April 2002 was both enormous and complicated, a collection of extraordinary monetary value, properties to reassign and renovate, a household to dissolve or absorb, a reported overdraft to settle, and something harder to quantify, a myth to maintain, because the Queen Mother's death had not concluded the Queen Mother project. It had merely ended its operational phase. In 2009, 7 years after the death, William Shawcross published what had been designated the official biography, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the official biography. It ran to approximately 1,000 pages. Shawcross had been given, in his own phrasing, unrestricted access to royal archives and family papers. In 2011, he received the CVO, Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, an honor given personally by the monarch for service to the royal family. The biography was commercially published by Macmillan. The palace didn't fund it directly. What the palace provided was something more valuable than money: access to the archives, full family cooperation, and the formal designation of authority. The book's Amazon listing described its subject as the most beloved British monarch of the 20th century. The New York Times review noted it chronicles the parties, the games, the trips, the charitable causes. The Guardian reviewer called Shawcross remarkably persuasive across what it characterized as interminable chapters. The biography set the authoritative version of the historical record. That was its function. It performed the function at length, with full institutional backing and at no direct cost to the palace beyond the access granted. The currency exchanged wasn't sterling. It was legitimacy. The Castle of May, meanwhile, had become a different kind of institution. The Queen Elizabeth Castle of May Trust, which she had established herself in 1996, opened the castle to visitors for approximately 5 months each summer after her death. A visitor center was subsequently built. At probate, the estate valuer had noted that it would be difficult to put a value on her association with the property. That phrase is the mechanism. Remove her connection, and you have a semi-remote Scottish tower house with a maintenance bill of at least £500,000 a year and a questionable tourism proposition. Retain the association, actively through King Charles's annual summer visits, through the Trust's interpretive materials, through the continuing story of how she found it in grief and restored it, and the visitors come. King Charles became the sole trustee of the Queen Elizabeth Castle of May Trust on January 1, 2019, and subsequently gave the property to the Prince's Foundation. He and Camilla visit each summer, during which the castle closes to the public for approximately 10 days. The association sustains the heritage sustains the value sustains the trust. The trust requires that the association be maintained. The whole structure is circular, in the way that institutional myths tend to be, and it requires someone to keep putting energy in. The Queen Mother Champion Chase at Cheltenham provides a different illustration. The race was established in 1959 and renamed in her honor in 1980, the year of her 80th birthday, in recognition of her sustained patronage of National Hunt jump racing. It's now a Grade 1 steeplechase sponsored by a betting company, run annually in March as one of the feature events of the Cheltenham Festival. Her name appears on every race card, in every broadcast, in every preview piece written in the racing press. She has been dead for more than 2 decades. Her name generates commercial value in a sport she loved, in a context she never commissioned and wouldn't have anticipated. These are 3 distinct, ongoing investments in keeping the Queen Mother narrative alive and accessible. The Shawcross biography in the Historical Register, the Castle of May in the Heritage Register, the Champion Chase in the Sporting Register. The palace directly shaped only one of them, and even that sponsorship was access rather than cash. The costs are real in all 3. They are ongoing. They aren't questioned because the myth is sufficiently robust that questioning it feels, to most people, like bad manners. The broader academic corpus has added its own layer. Studies of British royal public image published through the 1990s and into the 2000s used the Queen Mother as a consistent benchmark for measuring popular approval. A 1999 paper in the European Journal of Social Psychology tested public attitudes by varying the context in which she was presented, using her as a known reference point precisely because her approval was reliably high. She appeared in social psychology journals, cultural studies texts, media analysis, and institutional histories. This is a different kind of expenditure, intellectual rather than financial, but it represents the same structural dynamic, an institution maintaining itself through accumulated documentation. None of this is conspiratorial. Heritage requires maintenance. Myths require tending. An institution that stops investing in its own story stops being legible to the next generation. And the royal family understood that lesson earlier than most. The point isn't that anyone did anything wrong in sustaining the Queen Mother's legacy. The point is that the legacy, like the life that generated it, was never cheap. The warmth was real. The hats were real. The racetrack appearances and the weekly house parties and the unanswerable charm at 100 public events a year, all of it was real. And all of it was the product of an enormous operational infrastructure that the public wasn't meant to see and largely didn't. She had been, for 50 years, the most valuable performer in the royal institution's public-facing repertoire. Not the most powerful, not the most constitutionally significant, but the most beloved, which is its own kind of power, and which required its own kind of sustained investment to remain credible. The investment was made, year by year, by the state and by her daughter, and by the mechanics of royal finance that nobody discussed in public. It continued after her death in the form of biographies and heritage trusts, and annual horse races bearing her name. And when the estate was finally valued at between £50 million and £70 million in press estimates, and transferred tax-free to the Queen, and the reported overdraft at Coutts was settled quietly, and the Clarence House staff were thanked and mostly dispersed, what remained wasn't resolution. What remained was the myth itself, still running, still requiring tending, still generating costs that the institution absorbed without complaint because the alternative was admitting that the warmth had a price. She didn't just leave behind memories. She left behind the cost of keeping those memories beautiful. That cost has been paid, in various currencies, by various institutions every year since. If you've watched other videos in this series, you already know that the Queen Mother was a complicated figure long before the financial picture came into focus. Subscribe to keep following the story.